Good morning and welcome to this conversation at the Center for Global Development. Today, we're going to talk about a very important subject, which is regional integration in Africa. And in particular, what can the United States government, through its agencies, do to promote regional integration? Now, why is regional integration in Africa so important? As our experts on the panel that we'll come to in a while will tell you, Africa is a continent where the countries, in terms of trade, in terms of economic activity, are less integrated than they are with the rest of the world. And for many years, governments in Africa have been trying to promote this, most recently by agreeing on a continent wide free trade agreement, which will bring together pretty much all of the countries in Africa into a market that is more integrated for investors and make scale a feasible proposition for people thinking about economic projects. Now, of course, rules are one thing, but you also need the infrastructure to be able to make that work. And that's where international agencies, donor agencies can help by promoting regional projects that will help to strengthen the transport links, the energy links across the region. Now, in terms of the United States government, I want to focus particularly today on the Millennium Challenge Corporation and its efforts, promising efforts to try and promote regional integration. MCC is a relatively small US government donor agency. Its main goal has been to help low and low middle income countries that are relatively well governed with programs that support economic growth and development, and through that, reduction in poverty. Now, until recently, MCC was able to work country by country by country in terms of its country programs. Even though many of the things that it was working on, whether it's energy or transport projects it was supporting, really clearly had a regional dimension to them. Well, 2 years ago, Congress gave the MCC the authority to be able to work not just country by country, but to work regionally. And the agency is off to a start, exploring opportunities to support regional integration in West Africa, where it already has country programs, compacts as they're called, in a number of those countries. And so today we look forward to hearing a bit more detail about what the focus of these efforts is going to be, and also to see what challenges that expansion in the scope of work will pose for MCC and for the partner countries. And I'm very fortunate that we're going to start off the session today with some remarks from Sean Cairncross, who is the CEO of MCC. And Sean has been with MCC now for a little over a year, since June of last year. And before that, had a distinguished career in the White House, in politics, and also in the legal profession. So after Sean's remarks, we'll have a bit of a conversation. Sean, welcome to this event. Look forward to the conversation we're going to have. And then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Sarah Rose, and an expert panel who are going to come in and talk about the set of issues that Sean will raise, and that we'll have an initial conversation about. So that's the sort of plan for the next hour and nearly 2 hours that we're going to have. And with that, what I'd like to do, Sean, is welcome you once again to CGD. We've all been looking forward to it. And before we have a conversation, it'd be good to get your take and listen to your remarks. So over to you.
Well, thank you, Masood, for the kind introduction. It's great to be here, and good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be here, and thank you to the Center for Global Development for having me. We've been looking forward to this conversation for some time, so thank you again for facilitating. Regional is new and exciting for MCC, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to provide an update. Okay, let me also say thank you to everyone at CGD for putting together this event and for the vital role you all play in the development community. Many of you watching today know that MCC is a different kind of aid agency. We started as an idea that the United States could do development differently by applying the analysis and expertise of the private sector, all with one focus: reducing poverty through economic growth. And what sets MCC apart is our data-driven decision-making process that utilizes rigorous analytical tools in developing our investments. We look first at factors holding back our partner countries' economies, and then we work with those governments to design our programs. So here's what we're focused on in a nutshell: data, accountability, transparency, evaluations of our work, and arguably the secret sauce to the whole thing, country ownership. In other words, we work on the really challenging stuff. So today, I'm excited to have the chance to talk about the progress that we're making on our newest authority, regional compacts. In 2018, the United States Congress and President Trump expanded MCC's authority to work on cross-border projects promoting regional integration and trade. And the reasoning behind this new authority is simple. Markets don't stop at borders, so neither should MCC's investments. Developing countries can grow faster, create more jobs, and attract greater investment when they're part of a dynamic regional market. And MCC can certainly serve as an effective tool to unlock that potential. We're, of course, developing our first regional investments with the same rigor and data-driven analysis that drive all the rest of our compacts. That is, we're working to make sure the implementation of this new regional authority is consistent with MCC's high standards of transparency and accountability, the things that have made our agency successful over the last 16 years. Our first regional investments are focused in West Africa. We've identified several projects with the potential to boost the economic integration in the region. First, there's a Benin-Niger transportation corridor between Cotonou and Niamey. And this border crossing is one of the busiest crossings between any coastal and landlocked country in the region. There's an average of around 1,000 vehicles crossing a day. An investment to facilitate trade across the Benin-Niger border could pay big dividends to the people of both countries. Such a project would also have a clear link to the MCC investment at the port of Cotonou in Benin's first compact with MCC, as well as the current MCC compact program in Niger focused on agriculture and roads. And last week, I had the opportunity to visit Benin, and I can report that the government is very excited about the possibility of this regional investment and what it could do for regional commerce. MCC is also in the preliminary stages of exploring a proposed power transmission line linking northern Cote d'Ivoire with southern Burkina Faso. And this project would allow for more power trading between Burkina and Cote d'Ivoire, as well as providing stability to our West African power pool network. Investing in projects to jumpstart economic growth through regional integration are all the more urgent given the context in which we find ourselves now in 2020, meaning we're all facing new challenges due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The U.S. international development efforts, including MCC's, have never been more vital to the resilience of our partner countries and their economies, and it's reinforced the need for MCC's engagement and model. MCC's investments in infrastructure, combined with the agency's unique ability to leverage those investments to achieve policy and institutional reforms, creating an environment for private capital investment, will be essential for jumpstarting economic growth in our partner countries. The pandemic doesn't change MCC's mission or evidence-based approach. Like I say, in many ways, it reinforces it. Our programs can act as a data-driven roadmap for economic recovery in our partner countries, and MCC's regional authority enhances our ability to deliver on our mission to reduce poverty through economic growth. Together with our partners in the interagency, the development community, and the private sector, I'm confident that we can meet these challenges ahead together. So thank you, and Masoud, I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, John. So I think that gives us a very nice overview. And um, I want to start by picking up on one of the points that you stressed, and that was really the point about country ownership, because that's been one of the things that has set MCC apart from many other agencies. Your focus on having partner countries take responsibility, take the lead, but then also be accountable. Now, of course, as you move from a national to a regional approach, you're dealing with more than one government on a project or a set of projects that are linked together. How does the country ownership work in that regional context? How have you found that in terms of the selection of projects, in terms of the pace at which they're being implemented? How's that working out?
Sure. Well, the first thing I'd say is, Masood, just to back up in the way that our board of directors and the agency selected this first round of regional compacts for development. Took a look at things and we voted on a group of West African countries where we wanted the borders to be contiguous. We wanted the countries to already be engaged with us on a current compact and have shown increasing commitment to not only finishing that compact, but for progress on our indicators as well, on our selection and eligibility indicators. And so what we've found with our bilateral compacts is that country ownership goes to the sustainability of our projects and to the accountability side. The sustainability side really starting with the buy-in that we have on the ground with civil society members and organizations that will be impacted by our investments. Because at its core, what we're talking about is strengthening the relationship between our partner countries' government and their own people by building confidence that the government will provide basic goods and services to its people and do what they say they're going to do. And so when you expand that to a regional side, both countries that we're engaged in have an interest in ensuring their eligibility, ensuring that buy-in on the ground as projects are developed. But there's also an increasing interest in ensuring that things are going well in the region. And so it's not a hard push on our side to better relations between neighboring countries, but the effect of a market and a joint project that we are engaged in together is inevitably collaboration and discussion and agreement, project execution, and results that I think have a follow-on knock-on effect that will be very, very positive for economic development and hopefully political agreement as well.
Yeah. So practically speaking, then, do you create some kind of coordination structure across the countries involved in a regional project and yourself, just to make sure that there's sort of ongoing interaction and cooperation and little problems get ironed out before they become big ones?
Well, Masood, you're putting the middle name of our agency is challenge for a reason.
Right.
And what you are putting your finger on is a great question. Right now, the way MCC compacts work is we set up what's called an MCA, a Millennium Challenge account in each of our countries. It's got its own CEO, its own board of directors, its own project execution and management team, right down to its own HR. It's an independent entity. It runs procurement, it runs execution, it runs analysis, and really implements the project on the ground. And the idea there is capacity building, sustainability, and accountability. But when you move from bilateral to multilateral, obviously that becomes a more complicated equation. And so I know you're going to be talking to our regional director, Mahmoud Ba, who's fantastic later on in this session. And I'm sure he will reinforce this is something that we're in the process of working through now. I don't know that there's going to be a one-size-fits-all answer to that question for MCC's regional projects moving forward. But like on the transmission line and like on the transportation corridor, one of the things we're attempting to do is make sure that we're engaged in projects where both countries have some experience on the MCA side already in that sector. So transportation or power, or if it were water, sanitation, and health, it'd be the same thing. And that sort of, which creates an efficiency there when we get to the final stages of setting up what it will look like. But that's something that we are currently working through now. It's an exciting thing to work through, and we look forward to, when these projects come to the board of directors, to moving them forward.
Well, I'm sure we'll have an opportunity at some point in the future, Sean, to sort of come back and then take a look and see what lessons we can learn from all of that. And I'm sure
that's a great, that's another great point, which I think is a strength of this agency. You better believe we'll learn from it. And the agency has a strong track record of not only learning from its, learning how to do things better the next time around, but making sure we're transparent with our stakeholders about what worked and what didn't.
Right.
The hope from that isn't just that our agency will improve its own ability to execute development projects, but that there are lessons that can be learned across the interagency and with our partners in the NGO and international community as well. So the design is to be an iterative learning agency. I think that the staff here is tremendous about doing that, and we've got a great track record.
And in fact, I presume that as you went through this, so you obviously people learn from their own experience, from the experience that they have, but you no doubt also reached out because multilaterals in particular have been trying to do regional projects for a long time, and kind of my own reading of these is that some of them have worked well, but then there's quite a few that have run into difficulties, and I'm sure there's lots of lessons from that you have taken on board in terms of your own design as well.
There are, and we appreciate all the work that our partners, like I say, across government, across the international community and the NGO community. They've been working with us, sharing lessons learned. There's been a great deal of outreach that we've done. But what I would say, Masood, is MCC sits, I think, in a very unique situation, and we see that in our bilateral compacts, and the same is true with our regional, which is all of our projects are grant funded, and on top of that, it carries the seal of approval from the United States of America that here is a government that is striving to do the right things in terms of institutional and democratic reform, moving toward economic freedom and investing in their people. And that carries with it access to capital markets and private capital and investment coming into the marketplace. It sends a real signal that is unique to this agency and allows us to tap those sort of institutional policy reforms so we can get at things like women's economic empowerment. We can get at things like blended finance tools that are difficult to otherwise reach, and reform in some of these agencies and regulatory systems or taxation systems that are difficult. Benin, for example, is introducing tariffs on electricity in order to ensure that the electricity compact that we're working on is a sustainable thing. That takes real political capital and will to do. It's not an easy thing for a government to do, but they're willing to engage that and make a commitment to do that because they want our partnership. They want that stamp of approval from the United States, and they want the follow-on things that come with it that really get to a country's ability to determine its own future.
I'm glad you raised that because, at the end of the day, when you look at the numbers, all the projects that international agencies, including the MCC, do clearly have an impact in themselves, but their real impact in terms of scale comes from the contribution they can make to helping to change policies, helping to put in place a better environment for private capital, including domestic capital. Because at the end of the day, even in the poorest countries, the bulk of development is actually funded from the resources within the country. And the question is, how well are those resources being used? And that's where the presence and contribution of agencies like yours, can, if deployed right, can really make a big difference at the margin, much bigger in a way than the actual volume of financing alone does. Not to minimize the value of the financing. You mentioned COVID, John. I want to just get a little bit of a sense of, it's hard these days to have a conversation on development without thinking about the impact of COVID. And there's a kind of obvious short-term impact in terms of the ability to work and then changing the way people work to be able to take into account the restrictions. You just had a trip to three countries, and I kind of be interested a bit to see whether, that was any different in the way it took place and happened as would have been the case in before the pandemic came. How did that affect that? But longer term also, in terms of your vision for the kinds of operations that you think will be viable, how do you see the sort of impact on COVID on the kinds of things that MCC will support?
Yeah, well, the first thing I'd say is really what makes me the proudest to be in this job is to represent uh, the staff at MCC who have managed their way through this pandemic remarkably well. It's an innovative, can-do set of people, and our progress on all of these projects, although undoubtedly delayed, has moved forward. And we were just in Benin. We were on the ground. All of our teams, our resident country directors, are back in the field. They are the PPE equipment and the safety, which is of course paramount for our staff, are in place, and people are raring to go, and those projects are moving ahead. So that was one thing I was impressed with. But I would say, to your larger question, the agency wants to make sure that moving through this pandemic, we stay focused on what we do best. And the need for what we do are hard infrastructure projects tied to real political and institutional reform. It's only been reinforced. And because those basic infrastructure needs, whether it's power, in Ghana, we're working on a power compact that provides the hospital with electricity, allows vaccines to be cooled, allows people to have operations with the lights on, where we're engaged in infrastructure projects that allows people to get to and from medical services more easily, where we're engaged across the world in water sanitation and health projects. We're in, for example, Timor-Leste in development right now, working on a water sanitation project that'll have follow-on health benefits. I think that structural underlying, that basic structural infrastructure is vital to the success of the health services that will be necessary moving forward in a future pandemic and dealing with this one. And in some cases, Masood, like in Lesotho, the data takes us directly into the health sector, where we've put together that first compact there, built 138 hospital clinics, a national blood transfusion center is responsible for 90% of Lesotho's capacity in that regard. And now we're back in development on a second compact working on efficient delivery of those services. So I think that this pandemic, in short, simply reinforces the model that we have, and I think the wisdom of the team of people who originally put this agency together.
So maybe we should end with a little bit of kind of gazing into the future here. So, we just started the regional compacts, and you're putting together the first one, and it's very clear focus as you've outlined. I feel if you fast forward 10 years, do you think regional projects are going to be like a niche part of the MCC portfolio? Like a little bit on the side, but essentially MCC will continue to be largely focused around bilateral compacts and projects? Or is this, do you think, like the future in the sense that, 10 years from now, that's what you will be concentrating on? Some large share of your ongoing portfolio will be around regional projects. So just trying to get a sense of how
Yeah.
important is this in the big picture?
Well, here's what I think. I think that that markets and economies in Africa, in particular, will move to much more of a regional scale moving forward. And so I think that our involvement and MCC's involvement, whether it's bilateral or on the regional side, will have regional impact. And just an example, we're engaged in bilateral compacts now that have regional impacts. We're engaged in a power compact or we finished a power compact in Malawi. That's allowed Malawi to hook into the Southern Africa pool through Mozambique. There are independent power producer contracts that have been signed. And so that's had a regional impact. We're working in Ghana, in Benin on power compacts that involves access to the West African power pool, or in Senegal, for example. And so all of those projects, it's virtually impossible to just have a bilateral compact that has a solely one country effect anyway. And so I think regional compacts are a natural extension of where things are headed already. But I would assume moving forward, and I would hope that MCC's future is a healthy mix of both.
Right, and I think in a way, as the way you said it, that in a way, whatever the instrument, whether it's a bilateral compact or a regional compact, the future of economic growth and activity in Africa is going to be so much leveraged by greater cooperation and integration across, just to get over the problems of scale and size, and actually to exploit opportunities, rather than have countries that it's easier to trade with Asia or Europe for many countries in Africa than it is to trade with their neighbors. And that's partly policies, partly regulations, partly politics, but it's also partly infrastructure. And that's where I think the future can help to make that a very different looking economic map than the ones that we see now. Sean Cairncross, I want to thank you for taking the time to come and kick off this conversation. As you know, so now the next step in this exercise is that we give way to a group of experts on a panel. Sarah Rose is going to come on stream and introduce the panel and moderate them. And I also want to encourage people who have had a chance, who haven't yet had a chance to ask questions, to please do that. And you can do that either through hashtag CGD Talks or send an email to events@cgdev.org, and we will make sure that we try and respond to your questions. So thank you very much, Sean. And I'm going to ask Sarah now to join us. Take over.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you, Masood, and really special thanks to MCC CEO Sean Cairncross, both for sharing your thoughts today on the prospects for MCC's new cross-border investments in West Africa, but also for your leadership of MCC over the past couple of years. We at CGD have been watching and writing about the promise of MCC shifting into regional programming. I think we first wrote about this back in 2015. So it's really exciting to see this take shape and to be able to host this event today to hear more concretely about what's next. So I'm Sarah Rose. I'm a policy fellow here at the Center for Global Development, and it's my pleasure today to moderate what I think will be a really exciting panel on how the US government can help support economic integration in Africa. And of course, we're going to take a particular focus on MCC's new regionally focused investments. So I'm going to keep my introduction brief so we can spend most of our time hearing from the panel and also from you. But first, let me introduce the experts that we have with us today. So Mahmoud Ba is the Regional Transaction Team Lead at the Millennium Challenge Corporation. He has been with MCC for over a decade in various roles, including the Resident Country Director in Cote d'Ivoire. And before that, he was Acting Vice President and Chief Financial Officer. We also have Marila Waliszewska. She's a Senior Economist in the Macroeconomics, Trade and Investment Global Practice at the World Bank. Marila is an expert in trade policy and regional integration, with a special focus on the impacts of trade on poverty and income distribution. We also have Ali Mbai. Ali is a professor of economics and public policies at Sheikh Anta Diop University in Dakar, Senegal. He's also the director of the West Africa Regional Graduate Program in Climate Change Economics and is a non-resident fellow, both at the Center for Global Development as well as the Brookings Institution. And finally, we have Jude Moore. Jude is a senior policy fellow at CGD, whose research focuses largely on development finance and infrastructure finance in Africa, but covers a range of other subjects as well. Jude was previously served in the Liberian government as Minister of Public Works, and before that as Deputy Chief of Staff to President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. So as you can see with this lineup, we're really well set, I think, for an excellent discussion. And we do want you all in the audience to be a part of it as well. And so as Masoud said, we encourage you to pose your questions for the panelists. And as he mentioned, you can do so either on the YouTube stream, you can tweet to @CGDev with a hashtag CGDTalks, or you can email questions to events@cgdev.org. And we'll make sure we leave time at the end of the discussion for your questions and answers with the panel. But first, I'd like to turn to Marila. Marila, since, you were the lead author one of the lead authors on a World Bank publication on the African continental free trade area. So you wrote the book, so to speak, on the economic implications of regional integration. So I'm hoping that to really set the stage for the discussion today, if you could tell us briefly about what is the economic rationale for regional integration, and then within that, what is the role of external support in advancing integration goals?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this panel. So as Sarah mentioned, we have recently completed a report looking at the economic implications of the AFCFTA. And I think we all know that it provides a major opportunity to help African countries diversify their trade and economies, attract FDI, generate new jobs, provide, accelerate growth and reduce poverty, and provide the opportunity to reduce inequality in several countries. However, achieving the full potential will require putting in significant reforms and also trade facilitation measures. So investment in infrastructure, energy, all of those elements will be critical. In terms of what could be the potential economic gains, the study that we conducted looks at the implementation of tariffs, non-tariff reduction of tariffs, non-tariff barriers, and implementation of trade facilitation measures. And those trade facilitation measures include, investment in soft and hard infrastructure at the border, reducing the cost of trading. And what we find is that overall, the continent's GDP could be 7% higher by 2035 once all of these policy measures and investment have taken place. Of course, the impacts are heterogeneous across countries. Some countries gain a lot more, but overall, we see a big impact on intra-African trade. The AFCFTA has the potential to increase intra-African trade by 80% relative to what it would have been without the AFCFTA. So in addition, the additional gains are the reduction of poverty, the potential to lift 30 million out of extreme poverty. It would also lead to faster growth wages for skilled and unskilled workers, both for female and male workers, with a bit faster growth for female and unskilled workers due to sectoral reallocation towards the sectors that employ them intensively. But without spending too much time on the economic gains, I just wanted to point out that COVID provides an even stronger rationale to proceed with the AFCFTA. Makes the case for it so much stronger because in the short run, the AFCFTA, the regional integration could support regional trade and regional value chains, but in the long run, it would make the economies more resilient to shocks by making the economies more diversified, by making them more flexible, and by enhancing regional cooperation. Finally, you asked me what's the role of the external support in this whole process, and just from the perspective of the World Bank, we are involved in several activities in support of the agreement and its implementation, and it has several elements. We support with the analytical work, and the report that which I've just been discussing is a key example of that, but we are also doing a lot of the analytics at the country level, and that also involves a significant data collection effort. We've compiled a new database on employment and wages of female and male workers in Africa, which I hope will be useful for several others looking at different economic analysis. And we also support negotiations. We have a range of experts who have conducted FTA negotiations, and they know everything from, negotiation of commitments in services, intellectual property rights, competition policies, all of those elements. And we are actively training the negotiators. And to find the silver lining in COVID is really hard, but it actually made the training easier, because before trying to get all negotiators in the same place was extremely challenging. Now we're conducting those training online, making them available to a much wider audience. And finally, we also will be supporting the implementation of the agreement through development policy loans and embodying the commitments of the AFCFTAs as conditionality in those loans. So, but it's just what the World Bank is doing. There's a lot of other donors and institutions that are supporting this process, and it's key, to build the credibility of the commitment to reform is to have all the financial support, the expertise of various donors and the international community. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Marila. That was a really interesting take on some of the activities that the World Bank in particular and other investors too are thinking about in support of African integration goals. And indeed, how you've had to pivot during these times of COVID as well. I think I want to put a pin in this, actually, maybe ask you a bit later on about some of the challenges more broadly with thinking through support for regional integration kinds of issues. That was something that Masood and Mr. Cairncross mentioned a little bit earlier. But before doing so, I do want to continue sort of this line of thought about, again, the rationale for integration. And Ali and Bai, I'd like to ask you a little bit about how this ties into some of your research in particular. So I know you've conducted extensive research on African labor markets in particular. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about, what stronger cross-border linkages, could really mean for jobs and for structural transformation opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and also for inviting me for this very interesting panel on such a timely topic. First of all, let me correct my title. I was the director of WASCAL, West African Science Service Center for Climate Change and other land use for Senegal. But since July, I'm serving as a vice chancellor of my university. So I just wanted to make this very minor correction. And this being said, I would like to come to your question now to say that intra-African trade is a very complex issue. When talking about intra-African trade, you have to make a difference between the myth and the reality. The myth is that intra-African trade is very small. When you talk about the official trade between African countries, you're talking about less than 10% of overall trade, of overall import and export. So this is a myth, but the reality is that Africans trade a lot across borders. And if you allow me, I would like just to share a couple of slides with you, my screen, to show you some slides. Do you see my screen? Hello, Sarah. Do you see my screen?
Not yet.
Let me. All right.
Yes.
Do you see it now? Good. Thank you
Yes.
very much.
Yes.
So yeah, formal cross-border trade is very limited because official statistics fail to apprehend the booming informal trade happening between across African borders. We have used some proxies to apprehend such trade. And here is one of such proxies. What we do here is we compare for some critical items. We compare imports per head in some warehouse countries like Benin. What you see here are the data of Benin. Benin is in blue, Togo is in yellow, and Nigeria is in gray. And what you have is imports per head. What you can see is that in terms of imports per head, Benin sometimes imports per head 10 times more than Nigeria. It means that Benin is just importing to smuggle out to Nigeria. And Togo is doing the same. If you look at cotton clothes, the same pattern emerge, even if the gap is much narrower. So this is one way to grasp this cross-border trade happening, which is booming. If you look at rice, we have done it for several items, and the conclusion is consistent, meaning that these people are similar in many respects. The only reason you can see this discrepancy in terms of imports per head is that these warehouse countries, meaning Benin and Togo, are importing to smuggle out to Nigeria, which is their bigger neighbor. Another way to apprehend the booming cross-border trade is to look at the structure of import by import regimes for a country like Benin or Togo. We could do the same for the Gambia or for all these White House states, meaning countries which economy rely on smuggling out to their bigger neighbors. What you can see here, and why are people importing? You can see that in Benin, only 25% of imports go to domestic use. 53% go to transit. Transit meaning official imports to their landlocked neighbors. But in the meantime, in the interim, you have a lot of goods disappearing, informally. And you have re-exports. Benin imports a lot to re-export to Nigeria. In terms of GDP, you can see that 55%, 58% of total imports of Benin went to Nigeria either through re-exports or through transit, meaning that through smuggling. So this big magnitude of informal trade is hardly apprehended in official statistics. And this is a very important point I wanted to make. And the employment involved are huge. One item I haven't shown is the gas, the smuggling of gas from Nigeria to Benin. And this business is employing up to 50,000 people in Benin, which is as big as the total public sector employment size. Okay, so only one sector, the smuggling of gas, meaning that the pattern of cross-border trade in Africa is highly informal. And one consequence is that jobs involved are mainly informal and highly vulnerable. In these tables, we have showing the rate of unemployment and vulnerable employment. And you can see that it's very, very, very big for all countries in this sub-region. So just to summarize, informal trade in Africa, like the informal sector, is gaining ground. I mean, the formal sector is losing ground to the informal sector, and informal trade is gaining momentum over the formal trade. Okay, and now what can be done to improve jobs and to jumpstart structural transformation? Here is what we have in terms of structural transformation. What you have here on the x-axis is the change of sectoral employment between 2010 and 2017, and this is the case of Senegal. And what you have on the y-axis is the ratio of sectoral productivity on average productivity. And you can see that agriculture, which is performing very well below the average sector, is also losing productivity. But trade is losing employment, sorry. But trade is gaining employment. So here is the pattern we are having. So what to do to improve that, and what can donor do to assist countries make improvement on that? I'm very happy to talk about the role of MCC in that process, because I served as a lead economist for Senegal in the current compact MCC is implementing in Senegal. And I can tell you that in order to make improvement on these diagnoses, we need two things. You need investment and you need reforms. And I can tell you that MCC is doing both. They are trying to foster investment, and they are also trying to boost reforms. It requires a lot of work. Clearly, investment will need to be scaled up. I'm not sure what MCC is granting to country, and which is significant. I don't think that it's enough to close the gap these countries are having in terms of infrastructure gap. But I think more donors could come in order to help fill in the gap. In terms of reforms, you have a lot of things to do to improve policies, because the single main determinants of these formal sector losing momentum and informal sector gaining momentum is twofold. One is the business environment, and infrastructure services play an important role in that. And two is the weakness of state. So the combination of both are found as a main single reason explaining why the informal sector, and in particular informal trade, is gaining momentum. I would like to stop here, and I'll be happy to clarify more on what has been said, should you need it. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you, Ali. It was great to be able to have the data to sort of back up the situation, what we're looking at in terms of, what is the actual rate of cross-border economic activity in Africa in particular, and also to have your insider perspective as the lead economist for the MCC compact in Senegal as well. I like the way you put that, that MCC is doing sort of two of the aspects that are important to tackle when thinking about some of these issues, both the infrastructure side of it as well as the policy reform side of it. Certainly, as you mentioned, the infrastructure gap is significant, and there's a large reform agenda. But to the extent that MCC has an opportunity in partnership with other donors like the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and others to contribute to that. So I want to take a shift here and look a little bit more specifically at what it is that MCC is doing. And so Mahmoud, I'd like to turn to you. Sean Cairncross gave us an overview of the investments that MCC has under development, but I'd like to dive a little bit deeper now. And so I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit more about the specific programs that MCC is considering. And I'm also hoping that as part of that, you can tell us a bit more about the process of selecting these particular projects. So, Mr. Cairncross alluded to this in his remarks, but, for bilateral country programs, MCC really has sort of a defined method of how it goes about selecting projects. And this is really rooted in a couple of different specific analytical processes, both a constraints to growth analysis that identifies the key sectors that could be important to alleviate things that are preventing growth from taking place. And then within those sectors, MCC typically conducts a cost-benefit analysis to try to identify that set of investments that promises to yield a high economic rate of return. And so, these analyses, while they're really part of MCC's trademark, they don't necessarily apply in the same way to the process of identifying, cross-border or regional kinds of investments. And so, wondering if you can also tell us about what kinds of analyses or other criteria that MCC really brought to bear to identify the set of investments that are currently under discussion.
Yes, thank you, Sarah, and thank you for inviting us here. Let me take on the process first, the selection process. I think Sean mentioned the selection and eligibility process, which I'm not going to dive too much into now, but that is fundamental to trying to scan or look at projects. The way I view it on the West African context, we have about 15 pieces of puzzles, and MCC only have a few of those pieces. So pairing those in regional integration context is just a part of the solution, right? So we selected about two country pairs, so we only have pieces of the solution. But in the steps that lead us to selecting a specific project, one element you mentioned is the constraint analysis. Well, the constraint analysis is a binding constraint to growth at a national level. So the question is, how do you extend that to a regional integration? So one of the things that we are trying to do now is try to do a regional integration assessment to see what are really the barriers to trade expansion in a specific country pair or region. And from that, try to get to sectors that will be binding or that will be constrained to growth. As you can see on the screen, we have done an investment scan in Benin, Niger, and we've done some in Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina. We have done others as well. But what comes out is that the transport and energy sectors surface as sectors that do have these binding constraints to trade expansion. I think the previous panelists have mentioned elements of that. So if we look specifically at the projects that we are selecting right now and we are working on, the transport sector in Benin, Niger is definitely one that I think Amadou has mentioned some of the findings in his slides that kind of reiterate what we are trying to do here. Is we are focusing on a transaction between Cotonou and Niamey, a road corridor. That corridor is not new. It's not a project. It's a project that has been talked about for a long time. But I think Amadou is right that MCC does not have the means to take on these large gaps. So what we would do is we would address segments on that road corridor that we have reviewed and analyzed and deemed those segments to be critical for the cost-effective movement of goods and services in that corridor. So in addition to these segments that are highlighted in green in this case, we have Bohikon Dassa and then Parakou Berebwe. And then in the Niger side, we have Dosso Niamey. We also have a bridge that we think must be included in the investment as an upgrade in order to make those flows, flow of goods much more efficient. To that, then we have the soft component, the policy reform. That's the hardest part of this whole thing, right? Though they may represent maybe 20% of the investment, but they are the most difficult part to do. It's whether it's road maintenance reform, whether it's axle load control and load limitations. Those are policy reforms that we will include in our investment package. And as Sean mentioned, this whole concept of country ownership and force that to be a condition precedent to some of these large infrastructure investment. The second transaction we're looking at is in the energy sector. And I think the energy sector has quite a lot of potential in the region, especially in West Africa. One, just because of the institutional reform that are behind it, right? So you look at the West African Power Pool, its master plan. I think it's all based on integrating the interconnection between the countries and flowing electricity in a very cost-effective manner. You have countries like Guinea that can produce very cheap hydro electricity, but does not have a way to take it out or sell it. But we have a transaction now we're looking at between Cote d'Ivoire and Burkina that has a history of trading electricity, but the infrastructure is not there to really trade it at a very cost-effective manner. So we're looking at a transmission line between Ferke to Bobo Dioulasso, and then from Bobo to Ouaga. That investment would include also installing substations and then upgrading equipment. To that, of course, there will be a foundational policy reform associated with this investment, and we do think that will connect the two countries. But not only connect the two countries, but there are also benefits to countries that are non-MCC partners, right? So by connecting Ferke to Ouaga, you are ultimately connecting what we call the backbone and the median bone of this power sector, which would allow electricity to flow from Guinea to Nigeria, or Nigeria to Guinea, the opposite direction. So these are all like investment we're looking at. And then obviously there's a third investment in our pipeline that is more like in the back burner. It's also a road corridor between Abidjan and Ouaga. That is an investment that we looked at as part of the national compacts that we are doing with Cote d'Ivoire that came up, not as a regional, but as a study that we did to see what is the impact of the port of Abidjan on the traffic flow between Abidjan and Ouaga. So I'm going to stop here, mindful of time, and I think that we can also address some of your other questions or any other question related to specific projects we are working on.
Great, thanks so much, Mahmoud. I think it's really great to hear in a little bit more detail about what MCC is considering. And one of the things that struck me as particularly interesting was how you mentioned that part of this project, while it's in 2 of the West African countries of interest, it actually brings potential impact to the region more broadly, just because of the way that energy access links among all of those countries. I know one of the sort of the features of MCC's model is its selectivity, and MCC is only able to work in a select set of countries in the region, but seems helpful and useful in particular that there may be benefits that can extend to the region more broadly as well. So Judy, I actually want to sort of spin off of that point a little bit too, and talk about sort of MCC's model and its application to this process. So you're very familiar with MCC from your time working with the agency when you were Minister of Public Works in Liberia for the Liberia Compact there. Wondering what perspective you might have on what particular strengths can MCC and its model bring to supporting West Africa's regional integration goals, and then are there parts of the model that might constrain its impact? Can't hear you right now. We can give it another couple seconds. If not, we can just come back to you with that question too, because I think that's one that we can revisit shortly. We'll come back to you with that one in a minute then. So a similar question, a line of questioning I did want to sort of get at is aspects about MCC's model. Again, MCC has a few major features of the way it operates. One is focus on accountable results. Another is the focus on real selectivity of what kind of looking at countries that are relatively well governed. And another, again, as Masood and Sean Cairncross were mentioning earlier, is this aspect of country ownership, in fact, which is giving country partners, really the lead role in seeking to identify priority investments and then managing their implementation. Ali, I wanted to turn to you. And again, I think you can probably draw on your experience as lead economist with the MCC Compact in Senegal, since you were part of those analytical processes that really did help to identify the investments that were included in that compact. But wanted to understand, how can external partners, like MCC, really ensure that they align with country and regional priorities in designing their own support for regional integration?
I think it's a very tricky question because you have in all the countries, African countries, in which MCC is intervening, you have a very clear master plan. So it would be good if MCC could support government implement these master plans. But sometimes, and very often, the reforms you need to undertake are to be undertaken against government. For example, sometimes if you look at the business environment, you have a lot of aspects where reforms are needed against the government. Because in many countries, you have a lot of studies showing that in many countries, and I just would like to refer to a recent study by Ali and Najman in Egypt under Mubarak's rule, but even after, where you can see governments, for example, taking interest in the private sector. Okay, and this is likely to bring about an uneven playing field between firms. So, for example, if you want to deal with the reforms, sometimes you have to undertake them against the government, and this is the trickiest part of the exercise because in French we used to say "l'agent est obstacle," meaning that in some instances the agent who is expected to undertake the reform can be the main obstacle to this reform being undertaken. So, but when the objectives are clearly aligned with MCCs, that is simple, but very often it's not the case.
Thanks, Ali. I think that's a really important point, and it's certainly one we've had discussions with other government officials in particular, or former government officials, I should say, as well. And there's the question about there's a drive for putting partner country governments and civil society, et cetera, in the driver's seat. But then what does happen when a need for reform sort of butts up against the interests of a government? And the question is a good one. And I think it looks like Jude's back, and hopefully we can hear him this time. But this might transition nicely into the question I posed to him a little bit earlier about, sort of what aspects of MCC's model do you think, will be particularly conducive to supporting these kinds of regional integration efforts? And then, are there parts of the model that could pose challenges?
Sure. Can you hear me now? Outstanding. And there's a drone in the back. I think my neighbors decided to do the alarm today, so please ignore that. I just wanted to go quickly, sir. Like you said, I have a lot of experience with MCC from trying to meet the governance goals in terms of the indicators and coordinating the government to do that, and then being in the position to actually negotiate the compact. I was there. So I just thought the perspective I'll bring today is, why this would work and what changes I think would be useful going forward. I think first is there are few development programs that are as useful as MCC, especially in instituting some sort of discipline in how the government conducts itself. Simply because you have to pass these 10 indicators, the government has to reorganize itself and be very disciplined in terms of how it governs. And I think MCC does that really well. And applying that regional, it could be useful too. The second thing is, I think, and that applying that on the regional level is that it forces connections at the technical level, whether it's in power, whether it's in energy, or is in water filtration. So the same kind of discipline you require at the bilateral level, you're going to need a similar kind of discipline at the multilateral level. And that can spill over into other areas for governments to be able to cooperate. And I think that's very useful. However, so I think regional projects might be new to MCC, but regional projects aren't new. Bilateral donors and multilateral partners have been doing this for a long time, and you can learn from them. I think you definitely should. part of the reason the Liberian Compact was so fast was simply because MCC combined with KFW, EIB, and NORAD. And they are partners in the region who are actually working on regional projects. So I'll just give 2 examples. One of them is AFIF. They've changed it. It was called the African Investment Facility. And this was money from the European Union to crowd in good public policy, especially on public goods, on regional projects. You could actually apply for this grant to be able to do that. So it kind of guided countries toward more regional projects. The African Development Bank also has a regional prioritization program with a regional envelope. So what happened was, if it's a project that developed a regional public good, as in like, especially for regional integration and trade facilitation, you got extra money out of the envelope to be able to apply to the project. So these are places where the MCC could actually work with those pieces on the ground to be, because the MCC doesn't have all of the money and never will for some of the problems that need to be solved. So I think taking advantage of what's available is going to be really useful. I would also say, one of the problems we had in Liberia was the result of the constraints analysis was that both power and roads were the binding constraints, but we picked power because the roads would not have met the internal rate of return that MCC had. And I think this might come up again where the project actually makes sense, but then the internal rate of return means that can't happen, even though the economic diagnostics says this is what we should do. So I think looking at that makes sense for MCC. And then I would say something else. It might be, I don't think it's controversial. It's just a suggestion. So the core indicator that a government has to pass is the control of corruption, right? I mean, there are countries, Sierra Leone, for example, that has taken a long time because they continue to struggle on this. Now, if you're doing a regional compact, my recommendation would be, if it's 2 countries, if it's 3 countries, if more than 50% of them have passed that indicator, the project goes forward. The coordinating mechanism will remain in the country that actually passed that, but that means the project can go forward. Because if we're gonna, of course we want to drive countries to ensure that this happens. But if, Sierra Leone is doing really well on that controlling corruption and Liberia isn't, but there is a project that could benefit both Liberia and Sierra Leone, why should we punish Sierra Leone for Liberia's slowness to adapt to this? And the final thing I would say on this, and of course then we can go to the question and answer period, is that times have changed. I know this is like I feel like this is a weakness of American strength. That the United States is such a powerful country that it tends to think of itself as exceptional, right? So MCC comes into the market and MCC is going to be like, oh, we're new, we're different. You're not, right? I mean, to a certain extent you are, but not really. And that space in Africa is pretty crowded now. There are lots of actors in that space. And I think MCC can actually advance its goals more, leverage its position and advance its goals better if it works with partners who are already aligned with the goals that MCC is trying to achieve there. So I think these are just my initial thoughts, and so giving the audience an opportunity to ask us questions. But I just wanted to stop there.
Thanks so much, Jude. Really important points, and leads into the question that I want to ask from Marila too now. And so, one of the key points that you really drove home there is that, this isn't new. It's new to MCC, but regional investments aren't new. And so, how can MCC best, partner with organizations that are already operating on the ground, other donors, et cetera? And this is something that, again, that Masood and Sean Cairncross were discussing at the beginning. But, Marila, from your perspective at the World Bank too, you've mentioned a number of the investments that the World Bank is undertaking there in West Africa in particular. But wondering if you could sort of take a step back and offer sort of an expansive view about, what are some lessons that maybe, a donor like MCC who's sort of new to this space could take in terms of diving into, engagement in regional projects that would be useful to convey to them. Thinking about the differences between operating regionally versus bilaterally, thinking about entering into partnerships with other actors that have been in this space for some time. Thank you.
Well, in terms of the regional projects, I think there is one of the key challenges that we face when we have regional projects, and I'm mostly focusing on trade and trade facilitation, so transport infrastructure investment, is the fact that you have, of course, differentiated speeds of progress, capacity implementation. And in some way, this is beneficial because these reform-minded countries can push the policy agenda forward in countries that are slower. At the same time, when you have progress in implementation in a number of countries and much slower implementation in others, it creates its own challenges. So it creates both opportunities and challenges. What we found that a clear, strong coordination mechanism is key. And also the recognition of national priorities at the regional level. So the regional bodies can support the implementation by providing a forum to exchange information, to have the space to negotiate the key policy priorities, but they always need to fully account of the priorities at the national level. Otherwise, there's no progress. So that was the biggest challenge. And also having the private sector involved. So the consumers, investors, traders who play a critical role in moving the reform agenda forwards and pushing for it at the country level. So having them involved in negotiations, in discussing with them what it takes to implement it and what are the key challenges that they're facing is key. So I would just highlight the need for coordination and involvement of the private sector. And similarly, the bank also has a regional IDA window supporting regional projects, and it's relatively new, and it requires it also releases additional funding. So when we have at least 2 countries that are either eligible or that are fragile or conflict situations, countries with fragile conflict situations, you can only have 2. But if you have other countries, LDCs, you need to have 3 or 4, and then the projects are constructed in such a way that it's either 50-50 or 2/3 of the funding is released at the national level, but the additional component is released if the regional commitments are met, providing an additional incentive to collaborate and move the implementation along at the more or less similar speed. But our trade facilitation unit that helps with the implementation of the WTO trade facilitation agreement has a lot of experience, and I'm sure we'll be happy to collaborate and provide more information on what worked and what didn't work in the context of the transport investment reforms in related to trade facilitation.
Thanks so much, Mariela. Now, we do have just a couple of minutes. I want to try to see if I can ask sort of 2 quick questions to two panelists here before we turn to the audience. I see we have a couple of questions that have come in. But first, Mahmoud, I wanted to follow up with you on some of the points that Mariela just made. She was talking about questions about thinking about implementation capacity, thinking about the coordination, the relationship between sort of regional decision-making bodies and the national level as well. So wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how implementation of these projects will be managed. I mean, I understand that they're in the development phase right now, and as Sean Cairncross pointed out, this is something that seems like it's still being worked out. What exactly this will look like may not look the same everywhere, which would likely make sense. But what will sort of the governance and implementation management of these projects likely look like?
Yeah, thank you. I think the fundamental question, though, I think relates to governance in the sense that here we are talking about grant money, right? So this is not a loan, and we are thinking through, looking at the lens of US taxpayers, what would be the most efficient way to implement the compact, given that the country already has an MCA? Because one of the requirements that we're doing, we're calling them concurrent compacts, is that they already have an existing unit. It is not efficient to have 2 MCAs with 2 CEOs with one agency, just for us, given the limitation of the size of the MCC. it's not a model that we think will be efficient. So we are exploring situations where we can model maybe MCAs that are taking on a new product line, or setting up a coordinating unit. I think what Marila mentioned is extremely important for us. For example, in the case of the Burkina Cote d'Ivoire interconnector, we are working with WAP, right, which is an existing institution, and seeing the governance around that in the development phase, how we can use the experience of WAP to get all the stakeholders together and trying to push these reform agenda and develop the compact in a way that takes into account everyone's view and position in all these issues. For us, this is going to be on a case-by-case basis. I think that if you look at a country pair like Benin and Niger, we are working on a road project, but the national compact is on transport, or is on energy and ag. Right, so those sectors do not lend themselves. So finding the model that works will require us to really iterate a few models and see which one will be the most efficient. In the case of Burkina, for instance, Burkina has an energy compact. So it will make sense for them to have a unit that is also expanding into transmission lines. So again, each one of the countries will have to be looked at and see where is going to be the most efficient way to implement this, given that we are using grant funds here and we have a strong oversight on Congress.
Great, thanks a lot, Mahmoud, for that, for the detailed, or the description in more detail of some of the priorities and the things that you'll be looking at as you set up these structures going forward. Again, do want to get to audience questions, but Judah, I want to leave you with the last question, and this is a bit of a pivot, but and it's a bit of a big picture question, I think, too, in some ways. But you are in many ways a student of U.S. policy in Africa, since you've spent time here in CGD, as well as in your positions in Liberia, certainly. And so, wondered if I could get your take a little bit on how you see MCC's shift into supporting regional programming, fitting into broader U.S. policy towards Africa at this point.
Thank you, Sarah. I think, we saw with the introduction of Prosper Africa and this whole of government approach, I think MCC collaborating and cooperating with other branches of the US government, whether it's US EXIM or the DFC, to be able to leverage US investment in a way where possible to crowd in the investment of other US government agencies to be able to leverage that and be able to do that. I think that's we're moving in a good direction. I'll come back to the question. I just wanted to make one quick point. One of the things that we struggled with initially on our compact was aligning procurement rules, because MCC was joining. And so I want to praise MCC here for the flexibility that it allowed. MCC was joining an existing project. And so to ensure that the project selection and the rules around that, all of that aligned with MCC's own rules. And so there was a meeting in Brussels where MCC sat across from KFW to try to compare. I think if MCC is going to go into regional projects, it's important now to know who are the actors in there. Are there ways that we can harmonize our rules so that if one of those actors is already on a project, it clears it for us to be able to join our project? So the European Investment Bank is active in the space, the African Development Bank, World Bank, KFW, CDC Group, and the Dutch Development Bank is also there. I think now, as MCC is thinking about doing regional projects, it's important to begin to have these conversations in the background to see if there are any alignments in terms of their rules and regulations that allow MCC to be able to work with them going forward. Now, going forward, I honestly think that the US government has a good number of tools now in its arsenal, especially in this policy in Africa, and MCC going to the regional level is really important, which brings us to the question of the FCTA. The US government, for now, has been, at best, ambivalent about the FCTA, and at worst, going in a different direction. All right, they want to do the bilateral FTAs and not focus on the multilateral one. MCC is going in a different direction. MCC is aligning itself with the direction that Africans are going into. So I think there has to be some sort of coordination on the US side in terms of how it engages. Less different branches of the US government are working at cross purposes, with some of them supporting the direction Africans are going in and some of them going in the opposite direction. But I just want to applaud the MCC for taking this step and going into regional company.
Thanks very much, Jude. So I will turn to a couple of audience questions now. We had a couple of folks write in with questions. Mahmoud, looking at these, I think most of them look like they may be for you in particular. And so I'll do two of them here at once. But then again, other panelists should feel free to weigh in on some of these technical aspects as well after Mahmoud weighs in as well. So Moses Mkwabe asked about, the extent to which MCC and the World Bank, so Marila as well, maybe for you to respond to as well. To what extent are they thinking about, how this could be investing in labor-intensive long-term jobs? And then I'll just pose the other question as well, and we can sort of treat them both before we close off here too. Benson Ireri from the World Resources Institute said that he is interested in hearing a little bit more on MCC's work on data and analysis in the energy space, particularly informing investments in energy access, as well as transition at the country and regional level. So we'll go over to you first, Mahmoud, to respond to that. And Marila, Jude, or Ali, if you have anything to add to, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, so I mean, the fundamental here is to look at investments that are expanding trade and also that are creating growth. So as far as like what type of jobs that investment will create would depend on the final segment or the final sector or the final investment that we bring to the board. The reform aspect that we include in the compact, I think that's where you see job creations, sustainable job creation stay. I think Amadou mentioned earlier the informality of jobs versus formality of these jobs. I think some of the work that MCC is trying to do is to move some of these into formality, right? Like have strong policy reform around, if you look at some of the work that we may be coordinating in road maintenance, those, if you look at the Benin Compact, I think those are to make these investments not only last longer, but be more sustainable, but have jobs that are more predictable around, for instance, maintaining roads. So that's just one example. And I think your second question, remind me, was related to, I'm blanking out on the second question that came from.
So it was the question from Benson Ireri from the World Resources Institute asking about data and analysis in the energy space, informing investments there. And then the other question again was about the looking for jobs, about how the implications for long-term jobs.
Yeah, so we have a team of consultants that help us in the due diligence phase, as far as like collecting data. And I think COVID unfortunately had delayed some of the work that we do, but we do send a team to collect data, and we rely on existing data where appropriate, and where we don't, we feel that we need to complement the data, we will complement the data. But our investment is informed by that due diligence work, which we have a few consultants that help us with, and subcontractors to local firms to get that data that would inform the investment memorandum that we submit to our board.
Great, thanks a lot, Mahmoud. Marila, would you like to add in on this question as well?
Just that the World Bank, obviously, we have a huge interest in the jobs agenda, and we believe that this investment in trade facilitation that MCC is supporting will lead to, not only more jobs but better jobs, including those in the formal sector. So obviously having these corridors and lowering of trade costs through AFCFTA will lead to a development of regional value chains, global value chains, providing new jobs, and also FDI, which tends to generate formal jobs. And also, obviously, the issue of informal trade is huge, but once you reduce the cost, once you reduce the harassment at the border through harmonization of regulations, but also lowering the cost of crossing the border, part of that informal trade will be will become formal, because there's simply the cost, the corruption, the hassle of going through the formal channels will be so much smaller. So just to highlight that I fully agree that both the implementation of the AFCFTA and the investment of MCC are supporting good jobs, more jobs, and formal jobs as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. And with this, it looks like we are just about out of time for today's session. I want to thank all of you in the audience watching and listening remotely to the discussion today. We've certainly had a really rich discussion on where MCC is going with its new investments, looking at regional integration in West Africa, talking about some of the challenges, talking about opportunities for partnerships with other actors who are working in the region towards regional integration goals as well. I want to offer special thanks again to Masoud Ahmed as well as MCC's CEO Sean Cairncross for their early remarks, and of course many thanks to our panelists for offering their expertise to us today, Mahmoud Ba, Marila Maricheska, Alim Bai, and Jude Moore. Thanks again very much, and we're really looking forward to watching this as it develops.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.